Welcome to Helping Organisations Thrive. I have the pleasure of Siobhan McHale on today onto the show. Welcome, Siobhan.
Great to be here today.
No, I'm glad you are, and you're all the way from Australia, so you're finishing your day and I'm starting my day. So it's great that we could connect and spend some time here. I just want to tell the audience a little bit about you. You're a culture transformer. You're author of The Insider's Guide to Culture Change, which we'll definitely want to talk about that as well. You're the Executive General Manager of People, Culture and Change at DuluxGroup. And you're a member of Thinkers 50 Radar 2020 as well. So wonderful background. I also know that you've done lots of change management roles in your career. It seems to be what you're about, is about change management, culture change. And so you've got a lot of expertise in that. And the question I always ask my guests when they come into this show is, what do you love about what you do?
Yeah, I love helping organisations to adapt and to change faster and with less noise. And for me, I've had a career in two halves, Julian. The first half was as a management consultant, flying across 4 continents, helping leaders to create more productive and constructive workplaces. And then I sort of hit the wall and I had a U-turn in my career, and I wanted to roll up my sleeves and actually make change happen. So I joined a series of multinational organizations as the executive in charge of change. So then I had skin in the game. I was the person responsible for working with leaders to make change happen. And I actually love that role. That's been the second part of my career, and it's a role that I really love, helping organizations to adapt and to pivot, particularly in times of disruption.
Fantastic. And what got you into that whole thing of change? I mean, obviously it's a two halves, but it's linked together with this aspect of change, isn't it? What was it about that sort of drew you to that?
Yeah, in the first part of my career as a management consultant, I was a change specialist, and I learned about the theories, and what I yearned to do was put those into practice. And you talked about the book that I've written recently, most of the books that I noticed on the bookshelves were from outsiders. And of course, the outsider perspective is vital, whether it be from academics or external consultants, or from even journalists who were writing about the topic of culture and change. But I thought there was something missing, and more voices needed to be from those people inside, those people who were doing change, people who are actually testing the theories and saying, does that work? So that's really the perspective that I'm bringing, I suppose, that not just an external observer perspective, internal practitioner perspective, and what you learn from that lens on the world. So I'm really passionate about not just my role as head of HR at DuluxGroup, but also my role as an educator. I'm really stepping into that role as an educator and helping people to understand, how do we make change happen?
Yeah, and that's what I've been inviting people on my show, people who are actually doing this stuff, as opposed to, and there's nothing wrong with being, an observer and bringing some value in that sense, but actually you're in it yourself. You're creating the change, you're executing change, you're developing strategies to help organizations. And that's what I like. And this show's about giving people real, whether that's insights or strategies to go away with that you can actually implement and spark some ideas. And, we've had the year of change in every capacity, in every part of this world, because of obviously what the pandemic's done. Now, change does produce opportunities, trying to look at it from a more optimistic point of view. But how do you manage such, and it might be even from your own personal experience at the DuluxGroup this year, how do you manage such constant change? And although you try to change a culture to perhaps grow, but also then you've got this massive external force creating completely polarization in certain aspects in people's personal life as well. So how have you managed it from a personal perspective, but also from your learnings and from what you've written? How would you talk to an audience in terms of helping them through this time right now?
I might tell you a story about a conversation I had recently with an HR manager at a consumer goods company. And he was talking about the fact that he said, Siobhan, we really need to create a more adaptive workplace. We need a more adaptive culture to pivot in these extraordinary pandemic times. And I started to explore with them what's happening. And it turns out that their push to create a digital offering for consumers was going too slowly. And you might think, well, it's going too slowly because there was a technology issue. But the more we got into the conversation, the more it was clear that it wasn't a technology issue that was causing the lack of speed to market. What was actually happening in his organization was that there was a pattern or a hidden agreement in the organization that the executives make the decisions around here. And that was an old pattern, and that was causing a bottleneck in the organization. So the executives were in role of decision makers, and the other part of the organization, the middle managers, were in role of waiters, waiting for the decisions to be made. And this pattern or this hidden agreement was actually running the organization and slowing everything down. And of course, it seems obvious when you see it. And he was like, oh my goodness, seeing that is so clarifying. And I can start to work with that cultural issue and point out and name the pattern and name the roles. And when I spoke to him about a week later, he said, it's amazing. It's just sort of shifted everything, and we're suddenly free of that constraint that was upon us. And this is what I'm finding, that the patterns that have run you, that may have served you in the past, you may get to these pandemic times and think some of those are no longer serving us, and we need to break them.
And obviously, there's that first point of getting sort of the clarity that there is a pattern, and it sounds really obvious, but obviously it's not that obvious because you highlighted it, and then he realised there was this sort of unwritten agreement at an exec level that this is how we do things. And so I guess the first thing is, how do you get into a place of recognizing them? Is there some sort of tools or sort of ways of doing that? And then how do you then unpick those patterns and make them fit or change, adapt, whatever, fit for purpose for the new way the business is working or needs to work, I should say?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And the first thing you've got to do, and I talk about step number 1 in my 4-step approach in the book, is about diagnosing the patterns. And this is often a step that we rush to solution. And I'll give you another example from a bank called ANZ, where I was the head of culture change. And over a 7-year period, we moved that bank from the worst performing bank in the country in terms of customer satisfaction to the number 1 bank in the country in terms of customer satisfaction, number 1 bank in the world globally on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, doubled its profits, tripled its share price, and vastly increased employee engagement. But the first step in that was walking into the bank and beginning to observe what's really going on around here. In head office, it was a really plush environment. There were marble pillars stretching up into the Gothic ceilings in the foyer, plush carpets, spacious light-filled offices. Going into the branches a week later, it was a completely different story, with threadbare carpets, paint peeling from the walls, queues of customers shuffling around, not getting the service that they needed. And when you looked at the roles of the head office was in role of order giver, and the branches were in role of order takers. And the pattern between them was we blame each other for the poor customer service, the poor customer satisfaction. It's your fault. No, it's your fault. So the order givers and the order takers blaming each other. Now, where do you intervene there? Because you could say, well, let's just train the people in the branches because it's their fault. But we didn't do that. We reframe the roles with a new operating model. And by reframing the roles, we got faster change with less noise. So that's another very important technique during any type of change, is the remarkable power of role reframing.
And I guess in that situation, it was almost like probably a parent-child type relationship, which I often have been in organisation where they have that sense of, the exec is the ones who give the orders out, and everybody else sort of runs off, and it doesn't create any sense of empowerment, doesn't create any sense of collaboration, and innovation, creativity just goes. And obviously, you did a role reframe. Is there a part to play in creating a sense of, I don't suppose, common purpose, or making sure that purpose or that mission, however you want to term it, is a bit more central to everybody, so we're all sort of going in the right direction, and then you work out what roles and how do we do that in the context of customer services, which was this situation.
Yeah, so at the ANZ Bank at the time, the CEO recognised that people had lost their sense of meaning. The community had lost trust in the bank, and in fact, bank bashing had become a national sport in Australia at the time. And the CEO recognised that, and his mantra was, we want to create the bank with the human face. And that became the mobilizing force within the organization. And then one of the values that we created, that every person within the 32,000 employees would lead and inspire each other. So again, during culture change or any type of change, you've got to get leaders stepping into their role to lead the change. Culture change is leader-led. So at this time, these pandemic times, it's really looking for what are the big patterns that are running your organization? What are the ways of relating that are no longer serving you? So by culture, I just don't mean employee engagement. I think for too long, we've just seen culture through that lens, but looking at what are those ways of operating, those ways of relating, and how are the different parts fueling those sometimes dysfunctional ways, and how can we break those ways of operating to survive and come out of this and thrive into the future.
Because patterns is as part of your central, you call it your culture map, and patterns is right at the heart of that, isn't it, in terms of how you articulate this culture change. And as you say, it's bigger than just employee engagement. It's every aspect of the culture, in terms of how the fabric, the mission, the why, the sense of what we're doing, why we're doing, and the direction. What other aspects? So you've diagnosed, you started to create some change. Is there any other aspects that you would pull from your book in terms of that sort of culture map process that you put in place?
Yeah, I think the important thing is the distinction between what I call the dancers and the dance. The dancers are the behaviors, and often we focus on the behaviors. So we might go into the bank and we might say, the behavior of the branch staff is the issue. But actually we fail to see the dance. The dance was the pattern of blame that was going round and round, draining the energy from the whole organization. And invariably I see with HR practitioners, and even sometimes with external consultants, they come in and they intervene at the level of the dancers. It's they go back into a single root cause, rather than seeing the co-created collective dance that the organization is in. And once you name it, you say, they're the order takers, the order givers, the order takers, and they're each blaming each other. And people just go, of course, it makes so much sense. But it's a bit like when you're in a dysfunctional family and everybody outside the family looks in on the family and says, gosh, that's so dysfunctional. Within the family, it makes perfect sense. It has its own internal logic, but outside you can see it. And it's often the same in organizations. You just can't see it when you're caught by it.
That becomes your norm. That becomes your world, isn't it? And I know I've I've joined organizations and suddenly gone, you meet, because immediately join an organization, you just see it very clearly. And you
Yes.
think, crumbs, this is not very, it's a bit toxic or whatever it may be, you might feel. But other people won't feel that because they've almost got so desensitized to it, I guess. How do you then take, because some of those patterns and some of those are quite challenging, and to perhaps an exec who get quite precious, and they use the phrase of, well, we've always done that, we've been successful, and they may well be successful. But the fact is they may be either losing staff or they're starting to not grow, or employee engagement's going down. How do you tackle it in a sense of with that leadership? Because ultimately the leadership has got to recognize this from your diagnosis and then put some action in place. And they may be unwilling. And how do you sort of, I guess, to get them to a place where they're a bit more willing? I mean, whether it's from a personal point of view, you've been in an organization, or from a consultant's point of view, how do you sort of create that place of engagement, I guess, with the leadership?
Yeah, and it triggers for me another story from an infrastructure company that I worked with. Let's call it Build It Pro, just for confidentiality reasons. I was working at Build It Pro, and they needed to change to a more commercial and higher performing culture because the environment had changed. They had moved from a soft contract environment to a hard contract environment where they had to bring in the infrastructure project within a capped budget, a fixed budget. And within the organization, what I noticed was this nice guy pattern. So the managers were all the nice guys, and they weren't giving performance feedback to employees who had stepped into the role of the underperformers. And I was dealing with Ben, the CEO, and we were in a meeting, and he knew about this pattern, but we were in a meeting one day and he said, oh, Siobhan, I'm really frustrated at the moment because I asked the head of marketing, Tim, to put a billboard on the head office roof to advertise our services in the local area. But 3 months later, and there's no billboard. I'm really annoyed. And it's just another example of this poor performing culture that we have around here. And I said, oh, I can understand how frustrating this must be. Who have you talked to about this delay? And he said, oh, I've talked to the head of finance, I've talked to the head of HR, I've talked to the head of supply chain. I said, okay, but have you talked to Tim about it? And he said, oh, no, I haven't talked to Tim. No, not yet. I said, okay, so you've talked to everybody but not Tim. And he just went, oh, I'm feeling the pattern. I'm being in the nice guy role. And I went, well, yeah, he had been caught by the pattern, which you say, well, that's madness. How could he be? But patterns are very tricky. They're very seductive. They capture you. As soon as he saw it, he immediately called Tim up, called him into his office, said, I want the billboard. It has to be installed by the end of the month. And sure enough, it was. But for him, that was when the penny started to drop, because patterns are fueled in different parts. And invariably, the leadership team, with all the best intentions, may also be fueling the pattern that they're trying to break.
And I guess it takes a little bit of a courage from a leader. I mean, that's an example where you need to talk to somebody and you gave some, almost held the mirror up of realization, which is really helpful. But when you perhaps realize it yourself in your organization, you know the pattern, you see the pattern, and actually you need to sort of change it, break it. It does take a bit of courage, because you are, it depends on what role you're in. Even if you're in a senior leadership and you're not the top boss as such, you've still got to step out to try and break those patterns, isn't it? And how would you, I suppose, I guess, give some counsel to somebody who's in that position right now, who they're seeing the patterns, they're not very helpful patterns, and they need to break them? What sort of advice would you give to them to try and step out in a way that's still embracing and engaging and creating that change?
Well, with patterns, it doesn't really matter where you are within the organization. You can break the pattern from anywhere. So I'll give you an example from my own job, my own role as the head of HR at DuluxGroup. When I joined the organization 4 years ago, I walked in and I thought, oh, we are in role of order taker here. The HR, it just has evolved into that role of taking the orders. So I held up the mirror to my own team and said, see this role where we just take instructions, we're the note takers, we take it down, we go off reactively, the reactive doers. I said, we don't want to be in that role of reactive doers anymore. We want to be strategic business leaders with a deep expertise in people, culture, and change. So we didn't really tell anybody that we were going to step into that role and break that pattern of you'll be told what to do around here. We just did it. And 4 years later, people are saying, wow, that, we've changed our name as well to people, culture, and change. But they are sort of saying, well, your team is different. We've stepped into being leaders, being business advisors, being much more commercial. And the pattern of us just taking orders has stopped because we're ahead of it now. We're getting there before anybody can tell us what to do. We've already got a paper developed. We've already got a recommendation. We've thought about it before anybody else has. So we didn't have to announce it. We just, this is the power of role. We each have a mental map of our role. And in order to bring about change, you change the mental map, which is, it's almost like a GPS in your car. And sometimes that GPS can be outdated and can, you're driving along and it's telling you turn to the left and there's no road there because it hasn't been downloaded with the latest information. And in organizations, that's happening all the time. You need to download the information, the latest information about the map of your role and what's expected.
So that's using the power of role modeling, and that's just leading by example, isn't it? And we know there is immense power in that because it's more than just the observation or what people see. It's people feel things as well. They feel values, they feel your intentions and everything else. And I think it's called Bandura's theory. I can't remember the guy's name. He talked about the whole thing about how it's more than just imitation. It's beyond just observing. It actually goes deeper in our subconscious and actually doing that. And that's why I talk a lot about leadership, about how you've got to, be a role model. But actually to break a pattern, you just, as you said, you just realize that we need to break it, rewire the map or the internal GPS and just do it. And then over time, people then start to observe that you're more strategic, you're more proactive, and then therefore then you just change the pattern by natural that, and then they don't start telling you because you're ahead of the curve with it. So that's powerful actually. And I think it's a real lesson that we need to start being a bit more leading by example in all that we do. That's really interesting actually. I like that, and that's better than telling people and announcing, as you say, because then people go, yeah, so what? But actually, if you're seeing it already, then it starts to impact individuals.
And sometimes as a leader, you're operating on multiple levels. So you might be role modeling on one level, but on the other level, you're making fine distinctions around role of different parts of your organization so that they can seamlessly work together. So in the case of the ANZ, for example, everybody's leading and inspiring each other. They're doing it from a distinct and different role. So the branches are doing it from the role of service provider to the customer. That's their reframe, get out of victim and into service provider. And the head office is doing it from its distinct role, which is support enabler or enabler of the branches. So again, not everybody is stepping over each other. They're clear role boundaries, because that's often the cause of noise, where you don't have clarity around role and role boundaries, or people are operating from an old mental map of their role. So they're still thinking, well, I'm in the role of decision maker. Well, no, you're not anymore. You're in the role of support provider. And how do you get that mental map to change as quickly as possible? One of the things we did at the bank was everybody had a day in the branches every 6 months, so people went to the branch for a day and they stood there while the customers were complaining and they saw the conditions, and they started thinking, wow, we need different tools, we need different systems, we need a different way of stepping into our support role. So as leaders, often we're thinking, how can we change the mental map as quickly as possible that people have? Because if you change the mental map, then you change the behaviors automatically. It's just like you have a mental map of a partner or a husband, then you might be a father, your mental map changes, then you might be a boss, your mental map changes, then you might be a subordinate, meeting your boss, again, your behavior changes. You might, after work, go out for a drink with some friends, you step into a role of friend, your mental map changes. So you don't need a training course for these shifts in behavior. You just have a different mental map that influences how you take up your role.
I really like that. And it ties into what I do in coaching, where I don't do a lot of this, but I get into conversations with clients where they're having conflict with perhaps their boss. And I do a technique, an NLP technique called perceptual positioning, which is all about getting a perspective from yourself, getting a perspective from the boss, and then getting a perspective from a bystander. And it's a way of almost mental mapping a different perspective. And through that different lenses, you create insights, understanding, and then ultimately an action plan comes out of that. And it's interesting, when I do the process with a client, I don't tell them at all what to do. They know better than themselves from their observations, but actually at the end of that process, they come away with, I know to solve this with my boss, because he thinks this, he thinks that, I'm doing this, I'm going to change this. And it's the same thing. By getting yourself into the branch, like an example, seeing it from a different perspective, your understanding is just completely enlightened. And it's very simple, and it sounds really obvious, but as you say, people don't do it. They send them on a training course, and you can't do that. You've got to then do this rewire, and as you do the rewire in your mind, therefore it changes behavior. I like that. That's really good. Yeah. That's powerful.
And sometimes you think it's the right role. Like, I was speaking with somebody recently who was promoted to role of manager, but she was still taking up the role of individual achiever. So running up that hill and nobody's behind her. So you say, well, you're not an individual achiever anymore. That's, you're actually a mobilizer. The role of mobilizer is different to role of individual achiever. And it was just like the light bulb went on. Oh gosh, I'm still taking up that role as if I was a solo operator and individual achiever. So just the subtle thing from achiever to mobilizer was incredibly empowering. And often in that situation, we'd intervene with personality testing, and we'd do lots of coaching. And actually sometimes it's as subtle as a reframe.
Yeah, and that's right. I think when people get promoted from to a team leader of some form, they do need to change their mental map, because it's very different. It's a different role, and I think sometimes they still operate, as you're saying, that on their own, and it's not quite like that anymore. It's very different.
They're not in real time. They're operating with the old GPS system.
We need an update. Absolutely, yeah.
Yes.
That's fantastic. Well, time is whizzing by, as it always does on these. We're already nearly half an hour in. That's brilliant.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, I suppose just one last thing. One sort of parting thought or advice you want to share just before we end this sort of interview?
Yeah, I would be encouraging people to think about their dual roles. You have a role to run the business, and you have a role to change and adapt the business. And often we have this one toolkit. We know how to run the operations. We know how to run, but I encourage people to equip yourselves with the toolkit to adapt and to change your business. That is emerging as a massive big need, and encourage you to step into that role, educate yourself, get yourself a toolkit. If you're interested in my book, I'd be delighted, for you to delve into some of my discoveries. The Insider's Guide to Culture Change is there if you're interested in learning more.
And where can people find that?
On Amazon. Amazon is probably one of the best places, or it's in all the usual online, and hopefully it's in the bookstores as well. I haven't been in a bookstore since 111 days here in my state of Victoria in Australia.
Oh, brilliant. I really do thank you for being on the show. Thank you for your insights. And again, I pray success for your your book. There's a lot of great wisdom in there, and it's not only from an outsider, as your book's all about, the insider. You're doing this stuff on a daily basis. So yeah, thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much, Julian. It's been a pleasure.